And I said, well, maybe, you know. It was like, so, the whole thing was freaking me so much. And he said, take them away, Jow. Take them and give them food. So we were taken and we were given magnificent food. We were together still. And sadhus brought us beautiful food, and then we were told to rest. And then after a while, we were brought back to Maharaji. And he said to me, come here, sit. So I sat down. He looked at me and he said, you were out under the stars last night. He said, you were thinking about your mother. Yes. He said, she died last year. She got very big in the stomach before she died. I said, yeah. He leaned back and he closed his eyes and he said, spleen. Died of spleen. What happened to me at that moment, I can just roughly, because he looked at me at a certain way at that moment, and two things happened which seem simultaneous. They do not seem like cause and effect. The first thing that happened to me was that my mind raced faster and faster to try to get leverage or get a hold on what he had just done. I went through every super CIA paranoia I have ever had, you know, like, who is he? And like, where's the button he pushes where the file appears? And they brought me here, and you know, and none of it would gel. I mean, it was just too impossible that this could have happened this way. And the guy I was with didn't know anything, and I was a tourist, and the whole thing was just too far out. And my mind went faster and faster and faster, because up until then, I had two categories for, quote, psychic experiences. One was they happened to somebody else, and they hadn't happened to me, and they were terribly interesting. We certainly had to keep an open mind about them. That was my social science approach. The other was that it happened to me when I was under the influence of a chemical, and how did I know I wasn't creating the whole thing? Because, in fact, I had taken certain chemicals. The greatest example I have of this is the thing which was called JB318, which I took in a room in Millbrook, and I was sitting on the third floor, and I took it, and it seemed like nothing was happening at all. And in the midst of this, a girl walked in with a pitcher of lemonade, and she said, would I like some lemonade? And I said, gee, that would be great. And she poured the lemonade. She was a girl from the community. And she poured, and she kept pouring, and the lemonade went over the side of the glass and fell to the floor. And it went across the floor and up the wall and over the ceiling and down the back of the ceiling and under my pants, which got wet, and it came back up into the glass. And when it touched the glass disappeared, and the water disappeared, and my wetness disappeared, and the girl disappeared. And I turned to Ralph Metzner and I said, Ralph, the most extraordinary thing happened to me, and Ralph disappeared. I was afraid to do anything but just sit, because whatever this is, it is not nothing. You know, anything, just sit. Don't move, just sit. You won't survive if you just sat. So I had experiences where I had seen myself completely create whole environments under psychedelics, and therefore I wasn't eager to interpret these things very quickly, because I, the observer, was under the influence of the psychedelic as well. This was not the case here, and my mind went faster and faster, and then what happens with a computer when it's fed an insoluble problem? Finally, the bell rings, and the red light goes on, and the machine stops. And my mind just gave up. It like burned out its circuitry. I needed something to get closure at the rational level, and there wasn't anything. It just wasn't a place I could hide in my head about this. And at the same moment, and this is what I say simultaneously, it did not feel like cause and effect, I felt this extremely violent pain in my chest and a tremendous wrenching feeling, and I started to cry. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried, and I wasn't happy, and I wasn't sad. I mean, it was not that kind of crying. The only thing I could say was it felt like I'm home. Like the journey's over, like I've finished, like, whew, it's over.
This concludes Session 4. Our program continues with Session 5. Sounds True presents Experiments in Truth, Session 5, Travels in India and Beyond, Part 2, with Ram Dass.
Well, I cried, and they finally sort of spooned me up, and they took me to a temple about 12 miles away to stay, and I stayed overnight. And that night, I had my shoulder bag there, and I was looking for something to make notes about this experience. I was very confused. I didn't yet know what had happened. I felt confused. That was the general feeling. Great feeling of lightness and confusion. And there was the bottle of LSD. I thought, wow, I've met a guy who's going to know. He will definitely know what LSD is. I will have to ask him. That's what I'll do. I'll ask him. Next morning at 8 o'clock, a messenger comes. Maharaji wants to see you immediately. We get in the Land Rover, we drive the 12 miles, and I'm approaching him, and I'm about as wide as this room, this distance from him, and he yells out at me, "Have you got a question?" And I take one look at him, and it's like looking at the sun. I suddenly feel all warm. All I want to do is touch his feet. And I'm speechless. No, I don't have any question. You know, I love you. I don't have to just let me near you. He's very impatient with all of this nonsense. And he says, "Where's the medicine?" So I got a translation of this. They said medicine, and I said medicine. I never thought of LSD as medicine. And somebody said he must mean the LSD. I said LSD. He says, Acha, bring the LSD. So I went to the car and I got the little bottle of LSD, and I came back and let me see. So I pour it out in my hand. He says, "What's that?" I said, "Well, that's STP, and that's Librium, and that's a little of everything." It's sort of like a little traveling. So he says, "Gives you siddhis?" I had never heard the word siddhi before, you see. I mean, this is where I was at in relation to these concepts. So I asked for translation, and siddhi was translated as power. So I thought he was like a little old man asking for power, like he was losing his vitality. He wanted like vitamin B12, you know. And there was one thing I didn't have, but I felt crushed that I didn't have what he wanted, and I put it back in the bottle. And he looked at me, no, and he holds out his hand. Okay, so I put into his hand what's called a white lightning. And this is an LSD pill, and this was a special batch that had been made specially for me for traveling, and it had, each pill was 305 micrograms, which was a special number. They were very pure. It was very good acid. 305, usually you start a man over 60, maybe with 50 to 75 micrograms, very gently, so that you won't upset in case he's got a heart condition, or, you know, you're very gentle. 300 is, you know, good. Well, pure acid is solid. So I put a second pill at 610 micrograms. Not third pill at 950 micrograms. That is sizable for a first dose, you know. Acha. And he swallows it. I see it go down, you know, I mean, no doubt. All day long, I'm there, and every now and then he twinkles at me, and nothing happens. Nothing happens. That was his answer. His answer to my question, well, what LSD was. I was taken back to the temple. It's interesting. At no time was I asked, do you want to stay? Do you want to study? It was always assumed. Everything was understood. There was no contracts. There were no promises. There were no vows. There was nothing. The next day, Maharaji instructed them to take out and buy me clothes. They gave me a room. Nobody ever asked me for a nickel out of this thing. Nobody ever asked me to spread the word. They never did anything. There was no commitments whatsoever required. It was all done internally. And that day I met who was to become my teacher, Haridas Baba. And Haridas Baba is quite an incredible fellow, as I found out. I spent 5 months under his tutelage. He is 48 years old. He weighs 90 pounds. He is a jungle sadhu. He went into the jungle when he was 8 years old. He is silent. He has been Mauna for 15 years. He writes with a chalkboard. He only sings holy songs. That's the only time he will speak. He reads and writes 6 or 8 different languages, like Chinese, English, French, Hindi. He taught me always in English, beautiful English. Maharaji has only his blanket, and they watch him. See, he's in I'll tell you about it in a minute, but he's in a place called Sahaja Samadhi, and he's not in this world in that sense. And if you didn't watch him, he'd just disappear off into the jungle or leave his body or something, but they're always protecting him so that they can keep him around. So they've got an entourage around him, and people come and bring gifts to the holy man, because that's part of the way in which you gain holy merit in India. And money piles up, and so they build temples, or they build schools, and they do all this around this guy. He'll walk to a place, and there'll be a saint that has lived in that place in a cave, and he'll say, there'll be a temple here. And then they build a temple. So Haridas Baba, this little 90-pound fellow, he architecturally designs all the temples and schools, supervises all the buildings, runs all the buildings, has many followers of his own, sleeps 2 hours a night. His food intake for 15 years is 2 glasses of milk a day. That's it. That's it. His feces are like 2 small marbles each day. That's it. When the workmen can't lift a heavy rock, they call for Chota Maharaji, the little great king, like a comic strip. And he goes over and lifts it, just with one pointedness of mind. And he took over my teaching, and I'll tell you about my life in the temple in a second, but he had met Maharaji in the woods, in the jungle, 15 years before, and he had become a disciple of Maharaji. Now, just to finish with Maharaji's type of style, I was going through my address book, and I came to Lama Govinda's name, Lama Anagar Govinda, who has written Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism and Way of the White Clouds. And I thought, gee, I ought to go visit him. I'm in the Himalayas, and it wouldn't be a long trip, and I ought to go and pay my respects. The next day, there is a message from Maharaji saying, you are to go immediately to see Lama Govinda. This was going on all the time, by the way. At one point, I had to go to Delhi to work on my visa, and I took a bus. This was the first time. It was 4 months after I got there. They were letting me out alone. They were so protective of me, it was unbelievable. I don't know what they were afraid would happen to me, but they were always sending somebody with me, and, like, they weren't giving me elopement privileges or something. They say in mental hospitals. But they allowed me to go alone to Delhi, and I took a bus, and it was a 12-hour bus trip, which is a far-out thing in India to go in these buses. And I went to Delhi, and I was so high, in such a high state, that I went through Connaught Place, which is the western hustle part of New Delhi. It's all BOAC and American Express and restaurants that serve ice cream sodas and, the whole scene, which is right in the middle of India, but it's like nothing to do with India particularly. And all the Indians who hustle Westerners walk around in this block. And I went through that barefoot, silent with my chalkboard. I was silent all the time in American Express, writing with my thing, And it was so high that at not one moment was there even a qualm or a feeling of anything. And I got so high that I went into some stores to buy things in Connaught Place, which is designed to hustle Westerners, and everybody knew I was a Westerner. And they gave me the stuff free. You sadhu, like blessings. It's a blessing to me that you'll take my stuff. That's how powerful the thing was that I was into at that moment. So after all day long of doing my dramas with the health department and so on, it came time for lunch, and I had been on this very fierce, austere type of diet, and I had lost 60 pounds, and I was feeling great, very light and very beautiful, but I decided that there was enough orality still left in me. I thought, well, I'll really have a feast. I'm vegetarian, but I'll have a vegetarian feast. So I went to a fancy vegetarian restaurant, and I got a table over in a corner, and I ordered their special deluxe vegetarian dinner from, nuts to nuts. And I had the whole thing, and the last thing was they had vegetarian ice cream. with 2 English biscuits stuck into it. And those biscuits, boy, I mean, imagine like cookies. Wow. And the sweet thing has always been a big part of my life. But I knew somehow maybe I shouldn't be eating those. I mean, that's so far out from my diet. You know, it's not vegetables, it's not rice. And I was almost like secretly eating the cookies in this dark corner. See, I mean, I was feeling very guilty about eating these cookies. Nobody was watching me, and it was all right. And I got away, and I went to the Buddhist monastery for the night, and then the next day took the bus back up to the mountains. About 2 days later, we heard Maharaji was back. He had been up in the mountains in a little village. He travels around a lot. He moves from place to place. And we all went rushing to see Maharaji. And I got a bag of oranges to bring to him. And I came there, I took one look at him, and I hadn't seen him in about a month and a half. I didn't see much of him at all. And the oranges went flying. And I started to cry, and I fell down, and they were patting me, and Maharaji was eating oranges as fast as he could. It was the thing of taking on the karma of someone else through food. And women bring him food all day long, and he just opens his mouth, and they feed him, and he's taking on karma that way. That's a way of doing it. And he ate 8 oranges right before my eyes. I've never seen anything like that. You know? I've never seen anybody eat 8 oranges. And the principal of the school was feeding me oranges, and I was crying, and the whole thing was very maudlin. And he pulls me by the hair, and what's left, and I look up, and he says to me, "How'd you like the biscuits?" Now, the impact of my relation to him was very profound in this sense, as they say in the Sikh religion, that once you realize God knows everything, you are free. And that I had been through many years of psychoanalysis, and still I had managed to keep places in my head. I wouldn't say they were big, labelable categories, but they were certain attitudes or feelings that were still very private. And suddenly I realized that he knew everything that was going on in my head all the time. I mean, I go back to the temple, and here I was, an impure guy, and I realized I've hit the jackpot, man. I really hit gold here. And I'd be going to bed, and I'd lie down, I'd pull the covers over my head, and I'd have a very worldly thought. Not necessarily a sexual thought. There were those too, of course, but I would have thoughts about what I'll do with all my powers. And then suddenly I would be horrified with the realization he knew that one too. And then I'd meet him, and he'd be so loving. Always so loving. And I said to Haridas Baba, I said, "Why is it that Maharaji never tells me any of the bad things I think?" And he says, "It does not help your sadhana." He wrote, "It does not help your sadhana. It doesn't help your spiritual work." He knows it all, but he just does the things that help you. You know, he'll say things like, "You gave much money to a lama in America 4 years ago?" And I say, "Yeah." And he'd always make me feel like I was a beautiful guy, you know. Okay, I'm going to feed one more incident into you about Maharaji, and I'll tell it to you, although I don't understand it, but I want to share it so that you are in the same position that I am by all this. By the way, the sculptor had said he loved Maharaji so much we should keep the Land Rover up there, and it was like Maharaji got the Land Rover after all. One day, we were going on an outing up into the Himalayas for the day. This was very exciting because I never left my room in the temple. I'll tell you about the life in a moment. Now, in this temple, or around Maharaji, there were 8 or 9 people, of which Bhagwan Das and I were the only Westerners. In fact, at no time that I was there did I see any other Westerners. This is clearly not a Western scene. And in fact, I was specifically told on returning to the United States that I was not to mention Maharaji's name or say where he was or anything. And the few people that have slipped by this net and figured out from clues that I have done in my speaking and their knowledge of India where he was and went to see him got thrown out immediately. I mean, very summarily dismissed, which is very strange. I mean, all I can say is pass that information on to you. We were going to have an outing, and there were about 8 or 9 people, and whenever there was a scene that would be involved, I walked last, you see, because I was the lowest man on the totem pole. They all loved me and honored me, and I was sort of like the beginner. I was the novice. I was like in a karate class or a Aikido class, you stand at the back until you learn more, and I was always in the back, and they were always teaching me. These sadhus were always teaching me. Everybody was very loving and very protective. So we went in the Land Rover, and Maharaji was up in the front. Bhagwan Das was driving. Bhagwan Das turned out in this scene to be terribly high. I mean, very, very highly thought of and honored, and he would play. He had started playing the sitar. He's a fantastic musician. And he'd started playing the sitar, and the Hindu people would just love him and love him and love him, because he would play bhajan, and he would do bhajan holy music. Better, just so high that they would just go out on it. And I was learning the sarangi, and Bhagwan Das was driving, and then there were all these other people, and I was way in the back, sort of on the toilet, which is in the back of the Land Rover camper. And we went up into the hills, and we came to a place where we stopped, and we were given apples, an orchard, and we looked out on a beautiful view. We stayed about 10 minutes in Maharaji. He says, got to go on. Got in the car, we went further up to the hill, and we came to a forestry camp, and it turns out that his devotees are people like the head of the forestry department, so they make available to him all of this stuff. So we got to this place. He went inside, and we all sat out on the lawn. And after a little while, message came out, Maharaji wanted to see me. And I got up, and I went in, and he looked at me, and he said, "You make many people laugh in America?" Yeah, I can do that. Good. He said, "You like to feed children. You like to cook and feed them." I said, "Yeah." He asked a few more questions like that, which seemed like, what are those all about? I don't know. They're nice questions, and sure, I love to feed children. And then he smiled, and he reached forward, and he tapped me right on the forehead, just 3 times. That's all. And then the guy came along, and he lifted me and walked me out the door. And I was, like, completely confused. I didn't know what had happened to me, why he had done it, what it was about. When I walked out, the people out in the yard said that I looked as if I were in a very high state, but all I felt inside was confusion. I have never felt anything since then. I don't know what it was about. It was not an idle movement, because the minute that was over, we all got back in the car and went home. I passed that on to you. You know now what I know about that. It's just an interesting thing. I don't know what it means yet. Now, I'd like to talk about 2 things. One is the specific kind of sadhana or method that I am involved in, including why I've come back to the United States and what that involves. And the second thing is, what is the implication of what's happening? Who is Maharaji, and how does he do what he does, and what's it about? Because it seems very obvious to me now, and I want to share that with you. And 2, the implications for Western psychology would be very obvious. I was taught by this man with a chalkboard in the most terse way possible. I would get up early, take my snan, my bath in the river, out of a pail with a lota, with a bowl, go in and do my breathing exercises, my pranayama and my hatha yoga, meditate, study. And then around 11:30 in the morning, this man would arrive, and with chalkboard he would write something down, like he would write, if a pickpocket meets a saint, he sees only his pockets. Then he'd get up and leave. Or he'd say, if you wear shoe leather, the whole earth is covered with leather. These were his ways of teaching me about how motivation affects perception. When starting to teach me about what it meant to be ahimsa, or non-violent, and the effect on the environment around you about vibrations, when he started teaching me about energy and vibrations, his opening statement was, snakes know, K-N-O-W, heart. Yogis in jungle need not fear. Snakes know heart. That is, if you're pure enough, cool it, don't worry. You got to be very pure. Okay, so his teaching was of this nature. And it was not until a number of months later that I got hold of Vivekananda's book, Raja Yoga, and I realized that I had been being taught Raja Yoga very systematically, this 4,000-year-old system, or it had been enunciated rather somewhere between 500 BC and 500 AD by Patanjali in a set of sutras, and it's called Ashtanga Yoga, or eight-limbed yoga, and also known as Raja, or kingly yoga. But it was not taught to me systematically. It was taught to me all at once, but it can be broken down into what's called Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi. And these 8 steps, the first 2 are concerned with purification. The third is concerned with the state of your body. The fourth is concerned with breath. The 5th through the 8th are concerned with mind. Now, the basic understanding of what this process is that through a systematic, self-imposed discipline, one extricates oneself from inner attachment to one's sense data and learns how to direct and move energy within your own body. That's the simplest way of stating it. And it all dovetails so exquisitely. All I can say, it is one of the most highly articulated systems I've ever encountered, and the deeper I get into it, the more exquisitely profound I see that it is in terms of an overall program of total cognitive reorganization and a complete change of energy expression or direction. Now let me be more specific. First in what the methods are, and then how the daily regimen of sadhana or spiritual path is. Yama, the first of the 8, has in it 5 components: non-killing, non-stealing, non-lying, non-giving and receiving of gifts, and brahmachari, or sexual continence. To say the simplest word about this, the non-stealing, non-killing, non-lying, non-giving and receiving of gifts can all be understood in the terms, well, the first simplest way of saying it is that it helps you to eradicate the entire subject-object relationship to the universe around you. That is, if you think of other people as him, her, or them, you are stuck in an isolated place. And the process of these is like non-giving and receiving of gifts means that if you are giving me a gift and you think I am giving it to him, forget it. I can't accept it. Because I can't accept a gift that makes our separateness more clearly stated. If, on the other hand, there is the resource, and there we are, you need the resource, you use it. You need it, you use it. Then it's all right. Understand that? In other words, it's the nature of the relationship that determines. And all of these things are to break down that place of subject-object barriers between people. The sexual continence one has 2 elements in it, as I can understand. The first is that most of the sexual desire is at the relation of subject and object, whether it's at the personality level or at the yin-yang polarization level. And it's a process of getting behind that one. And we'll talk a little more about Tantra and stuff like that in a second. And the other idea is that you are learning how to take what is called sexual energy, or bindu, and convert it to ojas. That is, you move the energy that usually would be localized in lower centers of your body and used for procreation, digestion, and survival, and you start to learn how to move this energy up your body into your head to use for purposes that will become apparent in a moment. So it's like conservation of energy at the level where you are still a finite being and have finite energy. The second set of things, niyama, is cleanliness inside and out, tapasya or austerities, contentment, study, and surrender. And these are very complex, and I won't go into them all. I'm just giving you the outline at the moment. Third comes asanas, meaning asana means seat, and this is hatha yoga. But you only do hatha yoga to the extent that you are able to get into a firm seat, such as the lotus position or siddhasan or something like that, and you're able to stay in it for 6-7 hours. You're able to turn off your body. You're able to create a triangular seat and just put your body at rest and turn it off. And another reason you do hatha yoga is to open up certain nerves, because while we are very sensitized to muscular control, we are not sensitized to nerve control. And most of the nerves that I have been able to experience in the past year, I had never known I had or had never experienced in the sense of inner experience up until that point, specifically nerves in my spine. And the third reason for doing asanas is it's a form of prayer. It's putting your body into a certain position which is a statement. The position itself is a statement. And to tell you how highly articulated this science of yoga is, when one has got it down right, your body is in a statement which can be thought of as a vibrational statement, which is in tune with a certain thing you visualize, which is in tune with a certain sound you emit, all of which go together to create a certain kind of psychic state. And these are all exquisitely articulated, labeled, and the amount of geographical description of the sound, sight, and feeling are extraordinary in these systems. Then comes pranayama, and pranayama is perhaps the most powerful of the methods, of the physical methods. It is a technique for control of prana, or life force. In order to do it, you work with your breath, or the muscles connected with your breath, which is your leverage on prana, or life force. And you learn how to compress, control, and use it to force energy up your spine. And this takes you into other states of consciousness. And now, when I am on my pure regimen, which includes certain kinds of fasting and living certain ways and so on, when I do pranayama, I am able to go into almost every state I could experience with LSD. And just as an aside, I would like to say that I am not taking LSD not because of any moral thing or not because of any feeling that it's bad or anything, but what I now see is that the psychedelics show one a possibility. They cut through the cynicism of the Western rational materialist and give you faith in another kind of possibility of your inner state, and then from then on you got to do something about it. I asked my teacher what he could say about LSD. He wrote back and he said, LSD is like a Christ that has come to America. He said, Americans are most materialistic people, and the avatar has come to them in the form of a material. How they will know about such things if they do not taste them? It is necessary for the young people in the Kali Yuga, in the Dark Age. And in a way, when you think about how Christ worked, he went around and he cured a blind guy here and a blind guy there and somebody that was dying or dead he brought back to life, and he showed people that there was another dimension of reality. And he opened up a possibility, and he generated faith, which spread out from that. And most of us that have experienced these other levels have supplanted the kind of cynicism with a kind of faith. And then come the whole method of bringing the mind under control, or bringing it or calming it down. Now, what is extraordinary here is that when I used to work as a psychologist in cognitive programs with people like Jerry Bruner, we were working in fields of cognitive enrichment and learning how to get children to think more and more creatively by reducing the punishment for high-risk thoughts, associations, and therefore increasing the rate and improbability of various associative patterns, and getting people to think faster and faster and faster about more and more far-out things. Now, there is a possibility, if you go far enough out on that continuum, you come to the place I'm going to talk about. There is another way, however, of going to the same place. When Einstein said, I did not arrive at my understanding of fundamental laws through rational thought, what we in the West have called intuition, now I understand how the game works much, much more clearly. there is a rate at which you can know things by linear thought process, by one thought after another thought after another thought. There is also a gestalt phenomenon of an experience of understanding how something is. This is something that is not in a sequential thought process. It is not thought itself. This is a method put forth by Ramana Maharshi, a beautiful saint in India who became realized at 17 years old, and for 50 years he stayed on Arunachalam near Madras. Beautiful, beautiful being. And he taught this very simple method called Vichara Atma, meaning method of self-inquiry. Who am I? And just to roughly take you through it, I'll tell you how it works, and it takes a long time to do it, but it's simple to know how it works. He starts out and he says, you sit down and you say, who am I? And then you say, I am not this body. Now you can put the I right in the middle of your head, and then you can experience your body as object, just your torso as object. And you can sit until you can see your body like you're looking, like I was telling you about that first psilocybin experience. You see your body as object, and the I is in the middle of your head. Now I'll go through this quite rapidly, and then you can read about it on your own. And then he says, I am not the 5 organs of motion. And then he experiences his arms, and he feels the arms as object with the I in the middle of the head. I am not the legs, and he feels his legs as object. The tongue is the 3rd organ of motion. The anal sphincter is the 4th organ of motion. The genitals are the 5th organ of motion. In each case, you experience the organ of motion, and you experience it as object in relation to the I in the middle of your head. Then you say, I am not the 5 senses. Now, when you are in a room reading and there is a clock ticking, you know that you read and you don't hear the clock tick. And then you finish reading and the clock's ticking again. And the clock was ticking all the time. Your ear was hearing the clock tick, but you weren't attending to your ear hearing the clock tick. And this is an involuntary process for most people. Well, now, there are 3 things. There's the clock, there's the ear mechanism, the middle ear and the inner ear, and, vestibular membrane. And then there is the awareness attending to the ear. So what you do is you develop that I becomes that place inside, and you watch the clock tick and the ear hear the clock tick. So you say, I am not the ear. You don't turn it off. You merely note the ear hearing. You note the eye seeing. You note the tongue tasting. You note the nose smelling. You note the skin feeling. Then when you've done this, I am not the 5 internal organs. And then you go through watching your heart beating, circulation, respiration, digestion, excretion, perspiration. 5 inner processes that you can get hold of a little bit. Sometimes more fantasy, sometimes more real. Very slow process. Takes a while. Then you'll lose it and you'll suddenly be identified with your leg again, and you go back and say, I am not the leg. You got to go back, and you go at the rate you can go. Now you're down to one place, which is the I in the middle of your head, which is the thought, I am here in the middle of my head. And then the last one is the clincher. This is the mind blower, literally. It is, I am not this thought. Which thought? The thought of I am not that thought. I am in the middle of my head is a thought. And I am not that either, you see. So what happens then is your thoughts become like on the Times building, the news going by in a ticker tape, and you see your own thoughts going by, but from where? The minute you label from where, you're not that either. Because that's another thought, which you're not. Now, if you are disciplined enough to be able to do this, and this is a very steep path, and it is the hardest method. It is similar to most other kinds of very fierce, steep paths, like Zen, for example. If you are able to do this, you extricate yourself. Remember that psilocybin experience I had, that place inside. You extricate that place from identifying with your senses and finally identifying with your own thinking minds. Because what you do is you go behind your own thoughts, so you see your thoughts as object. Now, when you do that, what you experience is very much like going through a doorway, and you enter into what is called the lowest state of samadhi. You may be able to stay there only a millisecond, or later on longer and longer time. But when you go into that state, you go into what the Sanskrit literature calls Sat Chit Ananda. Sat Chit Ananda, which I'll describe briefly to you. And this is explaining to you now where Maharaji's head is at, what Sahaja Samadhi is, what state he's in. But let me preface it by saying this, that in order to get through that doorway, you have done that method. That method is a method of using the mind to turn in on the mind. Do you see how that's done? You brought the mind down, brought it away and away and away, and then turned it in on itself and said, I'm not that either. That's that method. You can get to the same place through breath. That is, I can take in my breath in certain ways and close certain muscles in my body that in the advanced techniques of pranayama, you take in breath after you've opened certain nerves in your spine. You take in breath and through muscular control you compress it and you hold it for various periods of time, maybe 60 seconds, maybe a minute and a half, whatever you keep developing, different lengths of time. Now, if you are just busy holding your breath like you would do when you're underwater swimming, you know that feeling where you dove down very deep and you're afraid you're not going to get back in time, you overdid your game a little bit, and I'm going to die from not being able to breathe. Well, if at that point you are able to completely redirect your attention, if you've calmed down your mind enough so you can make it one-pointed, you can put your attention somewhere else, and the idea of somebody who is not having breath ceases to be. Right? For example, in this exercise, what you do is you focus your consciousness completely on what's called the Muladhara, the first chakra, which is down near the base of the spine. You visualize a yellow triangle of flame, in which is a lingam, a phallus, around which is wound a snake 3.5 times with its head pointed down. And you put your entire attention right at that place. And if you can keep your attention at that place, there is no experience of running out of air. And after a certain period of time, through merely a subtlest mental process, you take this block of air, which you use like a hammer, and you knock down on the head of the snake. And the snake lifts its head, and it starts to climb up your spine. And you experience this extraordinary, words will completely fall away at this point, this moving of energy up your spine. It's as if all of the sexual energy, all of the power, force starts to come up your spine, and slowly it moves up and up and up, and you keep going into other states of consciousness, which are connected with these various centers or chakras through the body. Now, I'll tell you my first experience with this. I'm holding my breath and holding my breath and holding my breath, and I'm struggling and struggling. Can I hold it a little longer? And suddenly I remember in the midst of this melodrama of, can I hold it? Like I can do it another, I got 10 more seconds to go, and the seconds are going faster and faster. And suddenly I remember that I'm supposed to be attending to the bottom of my spine. And I put my consciousness down the bottom of the spine, and a whole new process starts, and suddenly there is nobody holding his breath anymore, and I'm still not breathing. And the awareness of that leads me to say, my God, I'm not breathing, which brings me down immediately. Right? In other words, I pulled back. I went back into thought. Okay? In other words, I came back into my thinking, rational mind about you're supposed to breathe. And having met a yogi who had been buried alive for a long period of time, whose arm was all eaten away by ants because they hadn't packed him well, and saying to him, well, how did you breathe? And he says, well, your cells store enough oxygen for your brain cells and your heart muscle, and that's all you need oxygen for. You can hear the degree of control that's involved in that, or the degree of attention. I mean, suddenly you realize what kind of universe I'm catapulted into in these mountains, in this simple little world of these jungle guys who are drinking like 2 glasses of milk a day and have more energy than anybody I've ever known. and who are tiny without big muscles and can lift huge stuff, and beings who don't have to breathe. I mean, we as psychologists can even imagine that social drives are learned, but like physiological drives, I mean, man, those are given. You can't screw around with those. That's what man is. Well, that's coming close to what the illusion is, or the attachment is. To understand Sat Chit Ananda and see where Maharaji is and how he's able to do what he does, I'll go on a really far-out excursion with you. Sat Chit Ananda means absolute existence, absolute knowledge, and absolute bliss. Let me try absolute bliss first. That's an easy one to get hold of. You do anything in life, you do. Say you're a high achiever, so you achieve. And you solve the problem. You get the job. You get patted on the head by your father. You get the award, the national award for something or other. You get the raise, and you get a moment of that feeling, a certain feeling. And that feeling is way, way inside. It's just a feeling of, yeah, right. And then a moment later, you got to start achieving again, because it's very ephemeral. You are a surfer, see, and you go surfing, and you finally find that wave, and you're right on top of the wave, and you get into that perfect relationship with the forces of the wave, and it's a mindless state. You had to give up so much thinking in order to get into that harmony, and you're right at that place, and yeah, right, and there you are at that place. You are involved in a sexual experience, and you get to a point close to climax, and you start to go into an automatic place where the experience takes over and the individuals involved start to disappear into the background, and there is merely a process, a very powerful natural process, and you again get that feeling of total what? Fulfillment, total here and nowness, total contentment, total, yeah, that's the way it's supposed to be. Oh, whew. Then it's gone. Now that little place, which is related to where you cook a particularly tasty bouillabaisse, right, with particularly good wine and so on, you sit down and the first bite you take, you've been waiting all day and cooking this thing and getting the fresh this and fresh that, take the first bite and, oh, yeah. Now, I used to take Gourmet Magazine. I've been the whole trip, you know. These are very familiar trips to me, I'm telling you. Very familiar trips. I used to have a motorcycle. You ride the motorcycle and you get into a certain centripetal relationship balance, you know, or hill climbing, a certain kind of leaping, or scuba diving, you're down in the water and there's that whole, here we are again. You know. Always great, but it always passes. Always passes. That place, which we are inclined in, because we are externalists, to identify with the method we use to get there. Like, man, sex is the trip. Baby, drugs is it. Scuba diving, all I want to do for the rest of my life is scuba dive. Everybody's got that thing. I'm a good mother, and my child is so healthy, I get that feeling. The thing is, that feeling is that feeling is that feeling is that feeling. And the thing is that the feeling is not the same as the means. And once you break that identification, you begin to see that what you're reaching for is that feeling. And the next thing you begin to understand is that feeling exists within you, not outside there. And when you say, I fell in love with this chick or with this guy, what you're saying is that person is a superordinate key stimulus that releases that thing inside you, innate releasing mechanism. You say, that is the stimulus that allowed me to taste of love. I am in love, meaning I am in that place which is love inside, that place, that feeling. Now, to describe Sat Chit Ananda, let me merely quote from a realized being, Ram Tirth, who said, describing the inner place, which is, of course, indescribable, we can only sort of approximate it because it has nothing to do with words or rational thoughts. He said the following, I am without form, without limit, beyond time, beyond space. I am in everything, Everything is in me. I am the bliss of the universe. Everywhere I am Sat Chit Ananda. Tat Tvam Asi. I am that. I am that. Now, what does it mean, I am without form, without limit, beyond time, beyond space? He is saying that besides the fact that you tune in on that place inside you, which is bliss, which is the place you were reaching for all the time out there, which turned out to be in there, that place of well-being, so that contentment becomes the standard operating state rather than the achievement. The other components are Sat and Chit, which is absolute existence and absolute knowledge. And now we're getting close to what Maharaji was doing, is that when you are able to go behind the identification or attachment of your awareness with your physical body and with your thinking mind, like a doorway, you go into a state where the entire world becomes subject. In other words, you went from many subjects, many objects, down to one subject, the I, and many objects, and then you go make that subject object, and you go into a place where it's all subject. Now let's see if I can tell it to you better. I'll give you a metaphor, a gross metaphor, but you can work with it. Take a solid object. You can know, theoretically and scientifically, that this is slowed down light. This is merely a pattern of energy, and it's at such a rate that to our eyes and to our gross senses it feels like a solid object. But you know yourself that with proper microscopy and so on and inference, that this is in fact is a moving pattern of light. What is light? Light is in itself slowed down something else, something other kind of energy, or grosser forms of something else. Thought, feelings, all of it is merely various patternings of energy. If you can go into the finer and finer and finer forms of energy, think of this as a continuum now. Get to the point of energy, the quanta of energy that is so tiny and so fast moving that it in and of itself has no individual differences. It is unique. It's separate from another quanta of energy, but it doesn't have any unique characteristics. That is, even the finest particle that we can call or label as separate, like an electron or a neutron or a neutrino or something like that, is in itself made up of patterns of this stuff. And this is all the same. It's all the same. Now, this stuff is moving at such a rate and is so tiny that it is totally interchangeable in everything of the universe at every moment. And I have experienced this state. It's called the clear white light, is one of the ways of describing it. You get to a point where you see that you are in a solid, that air, bodies, this, light is all merely different patterns, or like whirlpools of this energy, configurations or patterns of this very fine energy. And it's all changing, so that that which is in you one moment may be in the light the next, may be in Mars, may be in the table, and all of it stays looking this way to our gross senses because of these patterns. Just like in a whirlpool, the water keeps changing all the time, but the whirlpool stays as a stationary thing. The same phenomenon. That's the gross world. Now, if you can understand what going into Sat Chit Ananda means, it means extricating your awareness from localization in any particular time-space matrix. That is, if I can pull out from my body, from my senses, and even from my thoughts, then awareness. Now I've got to give you an identity that is going to be so hard for you to grok in Heinlein's terms. This is a really hard one to grasp or to deal with. But I'll say it directly and let the chips fly where they will. That energy is an identity with consciousness. Not an equality, an identity. It is the same thing as consciousness. Not self-consciousness, mind you, but consciousness. Now, if you understand that, or can think from that point of view, you can understand that when you go behind a time-space locus, you enter into a place where you are one with consciousness. You are merely consciousness. You are no longer me being conscious. You are consciousness. If you understand the implications of it, you have become merely part of that energy. Remember what Ron Tiff said, I am without form, without limit, beyond time, beyond space. I am in everything. Everything is in me. To take you the next step, all I can say is that Maharaji is my mother's spleen. Thus, Chit, meaning absolute knowledge, means that everything that is known or knowable already is inside. You can see how this works. That when you go in, behind, you come to a place where you are one with the universe. You are one with the universe. And at that point, you are it all. Now, let me explain what the Westerner's dilemma is. There is a fantastic Western attachment to the rational mind. That is, to know you know. To know you know. Ram Dass, I, Richard Alpert, want to know I know. The problem is that a finite knower cannot know infinite knowledge. It just can't be done within the system. You can get little bits of it, but you can't know it. You can, however, be it. You can be it, but you can't know it. And the problem is, here's what's happened. If you look at the evolution of man, you can see a drama that as man goes on this scale, this evolutionary sequence, which I can see as a sequence into higher and higher consciousness, man develops more and more capacities which bring him closer, but at the same time they give him more powers. And over again he gets attached to his powers. See, like you take the strongest ape, he's got fantastic physical power, and he gets very attached to that. And the whole system gets attached to physical power. And at this plane, this has to it a lot of powers too. Look at, we can put a man on the moon. Look at the technology we've got. Look at how much we've done in the external world. What a fantastic siddhi, or power. And the thing was that the Vedas, the realized beings, warned us over and over again, when you get each power, you've got to give it up to go on. If at any point you stop to take your power, man, that's where you're stuck. Stuck for this lifetime, stuck for this round, stuck until you're willing to give up even that power. You've got to give up the knowing you know in order to know. You've got to give up that subject-object relationship to knowledge in order to be wisdom. And the thing is, by being wisdom, out of it comes the right responses. But you cannot articulate the knowing you know in a very high level. I mean, most of what I'm saying is reasonably trivial compared to what it is that I experience. Ramakrishna has a beautiful example. He was demonstrating to his students. He was trying to describe what happened when the Kundalini rose up the spine, and he said, when it gets here, and he described this, and then when it gets here, you feel this. And he said, and then when it gets to the ajna, and then he went into samadhi. He went out. And after a little while, they held him up, and he came back, and he said, now, as I was saying, when you hear this happens, and then when you get to here, and he went out. And after 3 or 4 times, the tears were streaming down his face, and he said, I really, really want to tell you, but he says, the Divine Mother won't let me. She keeps sealing my lips. It's like you get to a point where it is not describable anymore because the rational mind and symbols are too inadequate to the task. And the thing is that an intellect, somebody who is attached to intellect, wants to know he knows, and you can get so close on that subtle plane of knowing you know. You get into what's called the causal plane, which is what the Egyptians were into, which are the basic laws of the universe. You begin to see how it all works. And you're getting to see how it all works more and more, and it's so exquisite, and you're less and less attached, and the less attached you are, the more you see. And you're so overwhelmed, but you still want to be the experiencer. Now, for example, when you go through that doorway, the first thing happens is you get waves of bliss. This is a very low form of samadhi, and at this point, you are experiencing the bliss. When you are having bliss, can you imagine an eternal orgasm? I mean, can you imagine continuous bliss, just on and on and on? How long before you're going to get bored with that one? You enjoy it for a moment, and then the Vedas are very clear. The books of the realized beings, they say, get on with it. You've got to give up that one, too. You've got to give up each power along the way, because unless you give up all of it, you don't get it all. You don't be it all. The way my teacher wrote it on the slate, and this is the most profound statement he's written on the slate as far as I can grasp at this moment, was the sequence: desire is a trap, desirelessness is moksha, or liberation, desire is the creator, desire is the destroyer, desire is the universe. If you are feeling horny, you walk down the street and all you see is what's makeable. If you are hungry, you walk down the street and all you see is what's edible. In the same way, the fact that you are hearing me through your ears and seeing me through your eyes, this is a much more subtle level now, is the result of your attachment to these kinds of data. And it is only when you can extricate yourself from this attachment. It's very much like you are a television receiver that came because this is your trip through nature as a nature being. You came with the channel fixed to channel 9. And you can't convert the channel. You can't turn it because it's very attached to channel 9-ness. Now, Channel 9 has worked great wonders because it's helped man survive and get to the point where we are, where for many of us there is enough. We are not fighting for survival. We have most gratification of our senses. Now what? Now is the possibility that we are ready to ask the question. In other words, technology brought us to the point that allows us to ask the next question, that allows us to get free of the attachments to a particular frequency, allowing you to turn the channel to another channel. I have sat with my guru brother, and I'll tell you something, he's the sanest person I've ever met. And I can sit with him right here, and I can look at you, and he can be in this room, and he sees none of you, and he's talking to some other beings that are in this room. Now, you and I both know there are television frequencies in this room, and if we bring in a receiver, we can turn it on, and there it'll be. You can't see it. These frequencies are available. You're not a receiver for it. The reason you're not a receiver is because of the directionality of your receiving apparatus. And therefore, what the discipline of yoga, meaning union, is a process for extricating yourself thought by thought, step by step, breath by breath, from the attachment to your senses and finally to your own thought process. This doesn't mean you lose it. It's still all there. It means that it becomes the servant instead of the master. At the moment, your thoughts are runaway thoughts. They run you. So you're sitting here, you feel hot, the hot takes you to another thought, that takes you to another thought, you feel hunger pangs, you wonder what time it is, you look at your watch, your mind goes, just like, as Ramakrishna says, like a drunken monkey. A monkey that's been stung by a scorpion and fed on wine. I mean, a completely wild, drunken monkey. You're having thousands of thoughts, thought after thought after thought after thought. So when you start to meditate, you first sit down and you find a thing to focus on, like the Southern Buddhists. They'll put you in a room and they'll say, focus on your breath. When you take in a breath, it goes up, and when you let out a breath, it goes down. And every time it goes up, you think rising, and every time it goes down, you think falling. Say, do you understand? You say, yeah. And then they close the door and they leave you there. 2 weeks later, they come back and say, how you doing? Well, what was I supposed to do? Just that. Well, didn't you understand the instructions? See that place that goes up and down? Every time it goes up, you say rising. Now, I, in the mornings, when I'm doing my sadhana, will sit maybe for 2-3 hours, just like this. Now, at first when I start to do that, the kind of thoughts that go through my head are things like, what an idiot. I got a PhD for this. Like, my knees starting to hurt. What do I do when I finish this? I forgot to call Dave. But I ordered that lumber. Like, what's happening outside? I hear a noise. What time is it? I'm nearly done. I've got thousands of these things. They're just like, they're like locusts. They're like little bugs, and they're just flittering around. Now, when you don't have any center focus, you have no leverage, so every one of them takes you on a trip. It comes along and says, here I am. Don't you want to think about your future? Here I am. Don't you want to think about physical comfort? Finally, you get to the point where, in this exercise, all you're supposed to do for the next hour until the bell rings or whatever it is go rising, falling, and while you're doing that, all the thoughts are going by, and you see them going by like clouds in the sky.